Hi, this is Chris Howard, host of Plugged In with Chris Howard, and I'm taking the Lions over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. BetOnline has free odds and lines available online or on your mobile device. Visit BetOnline today.
Now is the time to embrace a new wave of workers. Every day, your team grows younger, more digital, and more drawn to entirely new ways of working, which means you need flexible solutions to connect them where business gets done. T-Mobile for Business was born digital. With America's largest 5G network, we can make it easier to work together from virtually anywhere. Your team may be changing, but with the right tech, it can be more productive than ever before. Get started at T-Mobile.com/now.
Welcome to this episode of Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we dive deep into events and topics around the business of audio through the lens of brands and the buyers who support it. I'm your host, Jennifer Laine, Head of Brand Responsibility, Innovation, and Special Projects at Oxford Road. In this episode, we're going a little bit further behind the scenes to talk about the business of audio and the secrets of the craft, which allows brands and creators to impact audiences and culture through the work they're putting into the world. This is a special episode, and it's one of our industry's key conferences just happened last week here in New York, the IAB Podcast Upfronts. We had a few members from our team attend the event. Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road, Miranda Romano on our executive team, heading media, but also joining us today, who were also at the event in New York, Spencer Semonson, media buyer, Kristen Duenas, our Associate Media Director, and Stephen Abraham, our President of Oxford Road. I attended the event as well. It was wonderful, but we'll get into that in a minute. What I'm more excited about is our special guest today, Matt Shapo. For those who may not be aware, Matt Shapo is the Director of Digital and Audio and Video at the IAB. And I don't want to say he was running the show last week, but you'll see his fingerprints. You'll see his fingerprints all over the conference. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that those of you who were able to come to the event were there. It was, we hope, a very good experience for all who attended. As you said, I was certainly involved quite a bit in the pulling together of that event, but it is certainly not accurate to say that I was in any way the person who was primarily responsible for it. It was a labor of love on behalf of many people at IAB, and we're just thrilled that so many people got a lot out of it.
And I mean, you're breezing over that pretty quickly. So many people got a lot out of it, but so many people got more than a lot out of it. I was fortunate enough to attend for a day. This was my very first podcast Upfront in person. And I know the past couple of years have been remote conferences, and this is your second year at the IAB, but maybe sort of the water cooler Monday morning talk. How, in your opinion, how have you heard this as compared to previous IAB podcast Upfronts?
You know, the water cooler conversation is continuing to develop. As is often the case, after you get done with one of the events, you come back to about 15 million emails and, a lot of catching up to do. So we haven't maybe done quite the debrief that we're all going to do with one another. What I can say is that before we have, gotten to a point where we have fully debriefed one another, the early signs are that we accomplished our primary goal. And our primary goal was to bring buyers and sellers together in a way that was going to allow both sides of that equation to improve their businesses in the coming year. One quick example I'll give you is that, I was talking to a colleague of yours at another agency that's focused in many respects on podcasting, and they were saying how much they had enjoyed being in the room and being exposed to some of the new shows and learning about some of the new shows, and that as they were sitting there typing texts and Slack messages to staff members back at the office about, oh, we need to consider this show, we need to think about that show, and that it would be suitable for a variety of different brands they were working with. So it was nice to see that sort of conversation happening and that sort of thinking going on at the Upfront. It's exactly what it was designed to do.
Well, I'm guilty of that too. As Spencer, who's on the call today, will have seen from her email, I was spamming her randomly throughout the course of the day with different networks and shows from my text to her inbox. But no, I mean, as a new time attendee, a first time attendee, I was really impressed at the quality of presenters. I mean, we had people like Conan O'Brien and Kelly Ripa and Emrata and others on site talking about the content that they have, talking about the networks that are supporting them. I guess maybe it would be great for our audience, for those who haven't attended, just sort of give like a 10,000 square foot view of what Upfronts is meant to do, like what happens, who is the event for, which you may have touched on a little bit, and what you're hoping to have come away with it, which you referenced is getting people in the room and having the conversations. But like, what's the North Star for the IAB with this event?
Well, I think the North Star, again, is to sort of circle back to what I said. We want both the buyers and sellers of podcast inventory to be able to come together in a way that enriches all of their businesses, right? So we want that to be principally done through the showcasing of the wonderful shows and the incredible diversity of content that exists within the medium. We also want people to understand how effectively you can measure if you're a brand or an agency. We want people to understand how effectively you can measure the success that you're having in podcasting. We want people to understand that podcasting is a medium that in many respects is, rich with the target audiences they need to reach. And all of these educational moments are things that we tried to put a spotlight on throughout our editorial content. And then, of course, we knew that it was going to be, incredible diversity of messages that were shared by the Upfront presenters themselves. But I think that North Star really is just making people understand that this special medium of podcasting is one where not only listeners, but advertisers can find wonderful things for themselves to both enrich their lives and also seek out opportunities to align with listeners that are enriching their lives by connecting with some of these shows that they love.
And there was a little bit of data shared on the industry, and I'm not going to rattle off too many bullet points, but some of the compelling data points that I came away with were that the podcast ad revenue grew 26% in the last year, bringing the industry to $1.8 billion. I think the interesting juxtaposition there is, as we see the industry continue to expand, continue to add sort of signature talent, blue chip talent, as we see blue chip brands starting to be able to invest responsibly in the space through the introduction of brand safety tools, et cetera. One thing that stuck out to me, and I know it stuck out to Stephen as well, so I'm going to have him speak to this a little bit, is you would think, I guess you would think that with bigger celebrities, bigger brands, bigger shows, bigger network investment, you would see a rise of content that was a little bit more general. You would see shows that are sort of putting out messaging, everything for everyone. But instead, we saw the rise of niche content, focusing on smaller audiences, focusing on very specific topics, focusing on an audience or genres that may not have subgenres yet, but we're diving into those. I guess, like, Stephen, do you want to share a little bit about, and Kristen, Spencer, Matt, feel free to dive in here, but that was one of the overarching elements that stuck out for me at this podcast Upfront, is like the rise of niche audience content. And I know, Stephen, you've seen it in sports, but I don't know, do you want to share a little?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Firstly, congratulations, Matt, whether it was all fruit of your own labor or a team effort, it was great. So thanks to the IAB for an amazing event. Although I will say that, I think a lot of the activity also happened off-site. It's rare that we all get together in the same location and can meet. So there's so many areas of value that came out about it, rather than just sitting and listening to a lot of very interesting presentations. Secondly, I think, talking about the talent that was there, it's really interesting. I've been throughout my career to many upfronts and new fronts. This was the first podcast upfront, but the degree of kind of interaction from those individuals struck me as being somewhat different, in the sense that, take Conan O'Brien, for example. Yes, I've seen him at TV upfronts before talking about his show, but that's, with all due respect, and he's a very well-known celebrity and comedian, that's his day job, right? Whereas his podcast, albeit aligned to one of the major networks, is his passion project, right? So you get this kind of real, from the very essence of why advertisers and marketeers and we as sort of brand advocates want to associate ourselves with that content, you can see it even on stage, the kind of passion that comes through. So that was really refreshing for me to see. I think, to your point, Jennifer, yeah, we have seen the rise of niche, but I think that that speaks to the very heart of what podcast is. Individuals and content providers and users and peers at home discover or don't discover something that they want to talk about in the world, and yet they have the means and the availability to create it and put it out there, and suddenly through a very short space of time can discover lots of like-minded individuals who want to consume that content. So it doesn't surprise me that the rise of the niche is happening. I see it all the time in my own personal passion projects, which is sport. For those of you who are on this podcast know my passion with soccer, or football as I call it with my accent. And, the number of fan-based sort of podcasts that have grown over the past few years, and the way that you can knit those groups together to not necessarily reach them all at the same time, but the individual net 1+ reach that is grown through those small passion groups is phenomenal. And I would argue is even more potent than buying some 4, 5 or 6 flagship shows. You buy 20 smaller ones, you get the same amount of reach, but I'd say the engagement was much more powerful. I mean, to some degree it's speculatory, but when you look at what TalkSport are doing in the UK, where they've created the fan grouped podcast network that they're now pushing out and selling, speaks to that. And I just think the rise of that is going to happen more and more as we get through. And what I call perishable media, whereas we all know that many people download podcasts to listen and kind of consume at their own nature. The very essence of sport and news and topical events is people want them in the same way that they want immediacy around TV or news or digital. And I think that's creating a very different opportunity for clients to get into the space and to get responses from consumers in a different way. So more power to the platform, and more opportunities to reach these niche audiences who are often or not, not necessarily tapping into the broad opportunities. The better it is for us as a niche buyer, and us as an advocate of our clients.
I saw a lot of talk about diversification, whether that was in the host background or in the content itself, versus like big announcements that came down. I saw like spotlighting of the Black Effect in the iHeart presentation. I saw a lot of diverse rhetoric around the NPR presentation. They looked at all of the different genre breakdowns, and that seemed to be more of what we were focusing on throughout. And another big thread that I saw a lot was each of them speaking to mental health. And that was in a variety of genres. I saw it in education. I saw it in sports. I saw it in just plain health and fitness, mental health. Almost every network had a mental health show launching, or had a big star who was speaking on that specifically. And I think that is partially because we see so many health services and health clients coming into the space. So more of the content is gearing towards that, which also makes sense because a lot of them spoke about doing limited series or branded series with the clients. So it just makes sense that that's continuing to trend. And we saw that through almost every single presentation, regardless of network.
If you guys wouldn't mind, I'd like to stick with the topic of mental health for a second, because I think you're spot on in making that observation about how it sort of was a thread line that ran through a lot of the upfront presentations. And the reason I'd like to stick with it is that I think that being a thread line is a wonderful example of why podcasting is the special medium that it is, again, for both listeners and advertisers alike. Conan himself was somebody, in fact, the only thing that he really called out in terms of advertiser support was BetterHelp. He mentioned that as being an advertiser that he cared deeply about. And he did so because he is, like so many of us, somebody who I think thinks of podcasting as a way for people to not only find their niche, not only find their particular community, not only find their voice through a conversation that maybe a host has, wherein they can sort of see themselves, but also as an opportunity to go deep on, topics related to mental health. People feel a sense of kinship. They feel a sense of friendship. They feel heard, both by the hosts, and then I think over time, depending on the nature of those communities, by one another as they get to know each other. So one of the things that I did at the end of the Upfront was I co-moderated a panel with a couple of hosts wherein we discussed their extraordinary ability to build communities. And we talked about how, from a monetization standpoint, they blend both advertiser support and then some subscription-based support. And they talked about not just their subscribers, but people who also listen to the ad-supported versions, getting to know one another at their shows. They go on shows sometime. And I think it's really important to sort of, double click on that mental health aspect, because the thing that's so great about podcasting, and I don't want to just sort of, belabor this or spend too much time talking about Conan, but I thought he exemplified this perfectly. The thing that's so special about podcasting is that sense of community, that sense of feeling heard, and looking at it as a medium that gives you an opportunity to sort of improve yourself, or at least improve your own outlook. And so then the last thing I'll say on this topic is I remember that Conan said during his very funny conversation about sort of the meaning of podcasting to him, he was talking about being on the street. You guys remember that? He was on the street and he ran into a fan and he said, "Oh, would you like a selfie?" And they're like, "No, I'm good. We don't really need a selfie." And then he sort of reacted with like, "Oh, okay." And they said, "Boy, you really are just as needy in person as you are on your show, aren't you?" And I think the point there is that people really get a sense of one another and actually feel like they do know one another in the podcast medium, even people who haven't met. And that's one of the things that's so special about it as a medium. It's what it gives to listeners. And it's another reason that advertisers can find opportunities to speak to audiences, because they do trust these hosts and they're going to be more receptive to advertiser messages because of that trust. So I thought it was important that you mentioned the mental health, because I thought it was sort of a gateway to why podcasting is so special as a whole.
Yeah, and I think like it's easy to sit back and you're watching presentations by major networks and you list 10 genres and they have shows that hit 9 of the genres. And so it can be hard to find a through line. But I think where a through line is beginning to form is through the explanation of their mental health and their diverse offerings. Whereas like focusing on mental health specifically, you have NPR's Body Electric, which I thought was a super interesting mini-series that they're coming out with, speaking to a relationship we have with technology and how much we work for our phone rather than let our phone work for us, et cetera. And then with Cumulus's Sean Ryan podcast, and the health challenges that he is experiencing, mental health challenges he's experiencing, and walking alongside individuals who have come out of the different types of service for our country. And that's where the through line was for me, where it felt like the mental health offerings that were coming out of networks were actually deeply ingrained in how a network chooses to place their brand values, how they share their brand voice. And I was really excited to see that. Whereas some of the other content might not be as specific to a network. It might just be a network believes in an artist or in a content producer, and they want to provide them a platform to let them do whatever they want, which is a great way to approach it. But there was a lot of consistency in these offerings. And then back to speaking to diversity in sports, I think one example specifically that I thought was interesting was the Believe Network, where they're combining major voices from the MLB, the NFL, the NBA, et cetera, and making sure that, speaking to Stephen's comment on perishable media, they get the game recap the next day from players on the team. They said they have players from almost every single team in the U.S. represented in a meaningful way for these sports recaps. And when you're looking at audience reach in a localized way, I think it's a first time really interesting way to be able to slice up audiences and geographies and demographics based on who sports teams are, where people are following, and what they might be interested in.
And it's not just about sort of being able to slice and dice things and get super niche and get all that next day content or real-time content about the teams you care about. But again, I mean, maybe this is just sort of my preference to always return to this, to borrow your term from earlier, North Star. But for me, it's another way in which podcasting is special. It's not just about the ability to deliver niche content to people who care about a particular team, but it is, and I can't remember if this was Connell Byrne or maybe Will Pearson, but I remember during the iHeart presentation, they made a point about podcasting being a wonderful place where sports conversations can be really reinvented in podcasting, right? Because it melts that barrier, as they put it, between fans and athletes. And I think that is another great example of what we're talking about when we talk about podcasting being such a special medium. It really does melt those barriers, not just between fans and athletes, but between hosts of all kinds of shows talking about any number of different topics and the people who consume that content, because it speaks to them and it means something to them. And so, yeah.
And he was sharing in that specific example, for the iHeart example, he was sharing how, yes, everybody saw what happened on the field, but podcast is the only platform where you get the conversation of what happened in the locker room. You get the conversation of what happened in the lead up to the huddle and all of these different areas. And it is so intimate, and you are able to share it that you feel like you were actually a part of the team and a part of the match rather than just watching from the stands or listening from your home.
Right. Like, I'm a big Bill Simmons fan, and I always smile to myself whenever he's talking about the Celtics, his favorite team. He's always saying we, and he always says, "Oh, right." He always catches himself like I say we, like I'm on the team, but you sort of feel like you're on the team and you're participating, and it's a wonderful thing about podcasts.
It's a cathartic environment as well, especially because the roller coaster of any sports season. For those who have been following Arsenal will know exactly what I mean about this weekend, where they capitulated against a lower league club and basically lost their title role attempt. All the fans came on the podcast of one that I listened to and were just, it was like a therapy session, quite frankly. I know we've been talking about mental health and BetterHelp and everybody, but it really is. It's where you get to share your highs and lows, and it's a wonderful platform to be able to do that.
Yeah.
One, I know Spencer mentioned the rise of co-branded or branded content, co-created content, and there was a huge announcement that came out of iHeart. Matt, I think you were in the room. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that they talked about, you're probably talking about Ruby, right? Their new branded podcast, I guess, content division, for lack of a better way of describing it. One of the things that really impressed me when they came out on stage and were talking about, branded podcasts was their point of view on branded podcasts often being some of the best shows out there, right? Period. Not just the best, shows for brands, but the best shows, period. And then I think they had, what was it, Joe Prada was his name, from IBM, right? And then he came out and he said, the branded podcasts, they're really just good storytelling. And so it is exciting, interesting, and I think important to see, really significant companies like iHeart bringing their expertise at creating wonderful audio content and storytelling even more earnestly to the branded podcast space, because there are wonderful shows out there like, what is the show that they support with IBM? I think it's IBM Deep Talks or something like that. I'm not getting
it was called No Nerd Cloud.
Okay, and then there's another one that they do. But again, the idea is that, these companies are not backing and being a part of shows like that because they have a specific sort of advertising message they want to share. It's because they want to align with content that is, again, what people in podcasting care about. Things that will enrich their lives, things that will give them knowledge they can use day to day. And it's a wonderful way for brands to just sort of speak their values without, particularly trying to advertise one particular thing about themselves. And you get these wonderful stories that aren't tied to a particular brand message. They're just great stories, great content for people. And it's a wonderful way for, again, brands to show their values and sort of align in that way.
Well, and I know Kristen, Spencer, Stephen, you say one of the true benefits of the IAB is that it brings so many people together, and you guys were able to go to more of the events surrounding the conference than I was able to do and have some of those conversations. Do you want to walk us through some of the events you were able to go through and what the vibe was there, what sort of the continuing conversations were behind the scenes or out of the conference?
That's tricky. That is tricky. So many of the events were at the same time, which makes it difficult because as of yet, I haven't figured out how to clone myself. There was a bit of divide and conquer. So Sony had an event on the day before Wednesday that I wasn't able to attend, but I know Spencer was at with Emrata, kind of speaking about her podcast, and so she can speak on that one. I went to a Wondery meet and greet where, I got to see some of our key partners and have some discussions about what they're doing in a more intimate setting. So I think that's always really beneficial about any of these events, any of these upfronts where you can have that conversation and it's not so formalized and like, hey, we're sitting down at a table and we're specifically talking business. It's helpful to have these events where we can chit chat loosely about what's going on. And honestly, I feel like in certain circumstances, volume depending, you can get a little bit more out of that, and have conversations that lead you in different directions that you wouldn't normally have in a very formal situation. So I think those are always very, very helpful. Spencer, did you want to talk about the Sony Emrata? Since I was
I attended a recording of the High and Low podcast with Emrata, or Emily Ratajkowski, and it was her first live recording ever, which was interesting because it's an interview-based podcast and she did exceptionally well. And that is not easy to do, especially with a crowd. It was in the Sony building because they're producing and distributing the show. And what was interesting is that her guest was very funny. They played off each other very well. And I was able to even bring one of our clients, and just getting that connection with the content as well as later the hosts at a meet and greet was just so important to build an awareness with the client around the show level, the network level, and also because they are in New York, familiarize them so that we can create a larger bond that can maybe scale appropriately. And it was also just amazing. I personally have gone to many podcast events, but I always pay. So I very much appreciate that.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
Hi, this is Chris Howard, host of Plugged In with Chris Howard, and I'm taking the lines over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. BetOnline has free odds and lines available online or on your mobile device. Visit BetOnline today.
Now is the time to embrace a new wave of workers. Every day, your team grows younger, more digital, and more drawn to entirely new ways of working, which means you need flexible solutions to connect them where business gets done. T-Mobile for Business was born digital. With America's largest 5G network, we can make it easier to work together from virtually anywhere. Your team may be changing, but with the right tech, it can be more productive than ever before. Get started at T-Mobile.com/now.
The one thing that I think is true, that events like this are opportunities for those sorts of natural organic conversations that Spencer was talking about. about to occur. And there are always satellite events. There are always events that people who are going to be a part of the Upfront put together either in the day before or afterward. And then to your point, Jennifer, also there's wonderful conversations that just happen throughout the day at the Upfront, in between the breaks. And it is some of those are the most important interactions that people have. It's that opportunity, like you said, Spencer, to really make a connection and have, a deeper conversation about something that maybe reveals, a piece of information that you didn't know you had that suddenly makes it easier for you to transact the business that you want to transact. So those kinds of side conversations are always important.
And so that actually kind of leads me into a question I have for you, Matt, is, there were 14 networks presenting, networks meaning like, obviously, other people were talking about data and a few other things in there. It's a tight schedule for one day, 14. And I imagine that there were other networks that you would have liked to have presenting that couldn't just because of the time. Do you forecast the IAB Upfront growing to maybe over 2 days so you can fit in additional networks? Because unlike a podcast movement, where it's a little bit more directed for podcasters versus, the advertising industry, I think it would be beneficial to have more opportunity to get in front of the advertisers and the buyers with what shows are upcoming. And having only 14 squished in there seems a little tight. So I'd love to know, kind of like what you're projecting for the future.
Yeah, so I should quickly add that my point of view on this is going to be, only one point of view among many at IAB. But what I can say is that there are already conversations internally about looking at ways that we can enrich the experience for next year. As I mentioned, we were just doing our first in-person Upfront after 3 years of virtual presentations. And so part of the decision to keep things really tight and focused this year was just based on wanting to make sure that we knocked it out of the park, after our first year coming back in person. But we certainly are already talking about and looking at ways that we can expand, create more of those opportunities like you're talking about for a wider diversity of people to get in front of folks and have the same kinds of interaction that people who did come to this year's Upfront had. And to build out a second day is certainly something that we are already looking at and will hopefully be able to achieve. I can't guarantee it, but it is definitely something that we would like to do.
You heard it here first. Upfronts will be a week-long conference in New York City.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the one thing I think we can all agree upon, and this is true of everybody on this call, it's true of everybody at IAB, and it's true of everybody throughout the industry, is that the industry has such wonderful storytelling, and we have such incredible communities that it absolutely warrants the full week. It warrants, as much time as we can possibly give to it, because it does enrich the lives of listeners. It does feature so many wonderful creators that are telling awesome stories. And it does, apropos of the conversation we're having here about advertisers, give advertisers an opportunity to connect with consumers that are uniquely receptive in this medium compared to many others. And so we are always looking and talking internally, especially as we've just come through the Upfront, about ways that we can enrich and expand it next year and beyond.
Yeah, I think one last point about that came up as a recurring theme during the conference for me is about connecting with audiences and connecting cross-channel and cross-platform and the different ways that people are going about that, whether it be creators or brands coming from different sides of this. And I know on the podcast, we've talked a lot about video, sharing podcasts on video platforms, whether that be YouTube, we've mentioned specifically. But I think one element that came up recurring at Podcast Upfronts, and Stephen, I know this is a topic you're interested in too, is companion podcasts and the rise of this type of content. And whether we saw that being called out with like Shondaland or Ryan Murphy or Love Island, there were so many different ways that creators are coming into the channel and expanding beyond the channel, and some really interesting data being shared about how audiences are preferring to buy audio ads versus video ads in podcast, etc. 82% prefer to buy video ads buy ads using the video of a podcast rather than the audio. And I think we haven't really found that special mix of what the best ingredients are from video to social media, how we transition from content creators in podcasts to TV shows, movies, events, or successful TV shows to podcasts, or successful movies to podcast. But I think there's some really interesting things happening in this space. Stephen, do you want to sort of share your perspective here?
Sure. I mean, specifically at the top of what you said, because you said quite a lot there, Jennifer. I can't catch it.
I know. I'm sorry. Compound questions. It's like my biggest fault.
Which bit? But no, I mean the companion piece. Companion podcasts. We've seen the rise of those, the immediacy and the passion that people are now jumping into them after their favorite shows, and obviously it's interesting, isn't it? Television has shifted. It's now lean in when you want versus lean back and be sort of spoken to as and when the network decides. And yet straight after, there's this opportunity to listen in and people are jumping straight on to talk about it. So I think there's a really interesting fit there where people can they don't want the show to end. They want to continue to talk about it and they want to jump in and make their point. So I think there's a huge growth market there, and we've seen it, and not for any fault, but when you're watching an HBO or whatever, it sort of literally says jump on the companion podcast straight after to continue the discussion, learn more and see what's coming up. I think it's a great way for fans to get even more out of the content that they love, and indeed for content providers to give that added further additional twist and make for an even greater conversation. And marketeers going to profit from that and jump straight onto it. So again, another opportunity for the platform to go niche and content Uber fans.
I think what I would do is stick also with the community aspect of it, right? When you're talking about things like a companion podcast for a popular television show, you were talking about incredibly avid fans who care deeply about that. And so it is another opportunity to use the podcast medium as a way of diving into it. But then I think, just going back to your point about what maybe is in it for marketers to align with podcast creators specifically, another theme that was important, I thought, at the Upfront was the extent to which the creators who are making podcasts that have that incredible trust and incredible relationship with their listeners are extending that relationship beyond the podcast into social media. And so just going back to some of what I was talking about earlier, about some of the hosts who were talking about the connection they're making on Instagram, right? And so this is true not just of folks that are completely ad supported, but in some respects, you were talking about Emrata a lot, right? So she's a podcast creator who has both primarily ad supported episodes out in the wild, but then she also has her subscriber only content. And I know that a lot of creators like her who have subscriber only content, what they like to do is, as an example, they'll give their fans that subscribe access to their I don't know if I'm not an Instagram user myself, but on Instagram I think it's your close friends circle or something like that, and it's a wonderful way to continue that conversation even beyond the podcast with these incredibly passionate communities of fans. And so it's just another way for marketers and advertisers to think about leveraging that trust and that relationship that exists between podcast creators specifically and their incredibly avid fans.
And I think the terminology itself speaks to it, companion, right?
Yeah, and that was one data point that came out too, speaking to social media, that 52% of podcast listeners follow that host on social media, and making sure that you're paying attention to both of those audiences and speaking to them in a consistent but different way based on the channel, and customizing that content, whether it be visual or audio, was really important. And they gave some examples of brands who are doing that well. But it's a topic that continues to evolve, and a topic that will continually be surfaced on this podcast. I don't know, any key takeaways that we haven't touched on today that we thought were relevant coming from the Upfront? I know it's hard to cram that many presentations into one day and try to give the audience a full recap on it, but I would imagine many of those in our audience already have read a lot of the press and listened to a lot of the videos online or were there in person.
I have a question, Matt. I mean, I'm assuming you attended the New Fronts on the 1st to the 4th of May as well. Would I be right in assuming that, or should I not assume?
You should not assume. I attended very sparsely on that because we were in a lot of preparation for the Upfront. Gotcha. I will, of course, be digging in very heavily. And don't forget, everybody who may be listening, for both the podcast Upfront and the New Fronts, for those of you who attended, you will be able to watch all of that video on demand. And so I'll be okay. I won't make that assumption, but I think seeing that digital is supposed to increase by 6% this year. I know it's a very mature medium now, and podcast is still in many ways, whilst it's been around for 10 plus years, still, if not even longer, well, much longer actually, but
to be fair, really kind of exploding over the last few years. Seeing that continued double-digit growth and getting to 1.8 billion, if still sub 1% of all advertising, I think is just a real sort of indication of the passion for the platform.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because when Jennifer asked her question, I was going to say one thing I wanted to make sure we covered before we wrapped up is, and again, like you said, Jennifer, this has been widely reported and it's been discussed a lot in the press and elsewhere, but I wouldn't want to wrap this conversation up without just sort of double clicking again on the fact that podcasting does remain the fastest growing medium in all of digital media for the second year in a row. You know, we reported in, and we talked about this from the stage during our opening editorial remarks, you know, in all of the digital media channels that the IAB surveys for its annual internet advertising revenue report, we were happy to see that we're still reporting growth, despite the obvious economic headwinds of the last year or so. But podcasting remains a place that advertisers are finding value. The 26% growth is not the 72% of last year, but it is still far and away the fastest growing channel, as I said, in digital media. And there's a reason for that, right? The reason is, as I just said a moment ago, advertisers are finding value. They're tapping these communities. And they're understanding that they can align themselves with, going back to your earlier point, Jennifer, all sorts of niche content that allows them to tell stories to audiences that are waiting to hear those stories. And I think it's an important takeaway. And Jennifer, I'll just circle back to one other thing you said. It's another major theme that occurred both at the Upfront, and it's been a topic of consistent conversation in audio committee and board meetings at the IAB over the last several months. Let's not fail to go back and remind everybody that there are all sorts of new tools coming into the marketplace, especially on the brand safety and suitability front, that is going to make it all the more efficient for advertisers that do want to tap these special relationships to do so with the confidence they need with respect to safety and suitability requirements that they may have for their media spend. And I think that you are going to see over the course of this coming year, as those tools become more widely used, a lot of additional new episodic buys, sometimes even in shows that an advertiser might initially think they didn't want to be a part of because they might have certain reservations about what they think that content is. But as you begin using some of these new brand safety and suitability tools, as you begin using artificial intelligence to really parse into the individual line-by-line transcripts for these different various episodes, you'll be able to include rather than exclude much more podcast content. And I think it'll make it all the more wonderful for the medium moving forward.
Well, and to that point, when you have these tools in place, some of the larger blue chip brands who are sponsoring the major network shows who also have companion podcasts, then we'll see an ad which is on TV, then brand messaging in the podcast, and then when you incorporate social and have a true holistic approach to chatting with the audience members there, I think could be a really interesting space to watch.
I have a question for you guys, if you don't mind. I'm just kidding. So, like, what are you guys most excited about at Oxford Road looking ahead to this year? Is there something? Is there a particular campaign you're excited about? Is there a particular activation, sponsorship, something with a show that you're, or just a general trend that you're excited to be tapping into as an agency this year?
Should I say yet again how excited I am about Gen Z and video and the built-in audiences that are finally being tapped into now, because it's all I ever talk about internally in the agency. And for me, it's just very exciting because honestly didn't watch too much YouTube. I was very much a, NPR, PRX, have the This American Life app to listen to every episode for 30 years. And COVID has made me into this video person. And as I see different creators rise up there, the podcasts are coming. I really loved Hala's presentation from Young and Profiting about distribution and how there are even newer ways to watch that we haven't even looked at. And she mentioned LinkedIn Live. And I've met with several networks who are starting to sponsor network LinkedIn content. So I think that could also be the next phase that we go into. It's just very interesting, though, to see the networks who definitely shouldn't go into simulcast, the ones who definitely should and haven't yet, and the ones who are just still holding back.
I came into Upfronts expecting to hear more about how AI innovation is sort of infiltrating the industry. And I was really surprised not to hear a lot of that from the stage. And I think as we get deeper into 2023 and looking at how other industries are really adopting that technology and applying it in meaningful ways, I'm very curious to keep track of that. We have an AI-focused episode of Media Roundtable coming out, I believe, in June or July. But it's something that we're tracking very specifically. There are already a few tools popping up that we have found very helpful outside of just the chat GPTs, et cetera. And so that for me is what we're looking at.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? And if you guys have to go, that's fine too, but I actually have
shoot. If we don't have a good answer, we'll edit this out.
Okay, very good. So like, I guess part of my curiosity is about how agencies like you may be thinking about AI with specific application to creative iteration. Is that one of the things that may be talked about in this June, July episode you were talking about?
It will be. It will be. There's a lot of talk about how is it gonna replace or augment, and I think that's the biggest discussion. And I think it's, I'm a great believer that we need to embrace these technologies to help us do things better rather than replace us. And I think those of us that are living in Los Angeles are feeling acutely what's happening with the Writers Guild at the moment, and they're striking with a whole bunch of discussions around, are they going to be replaced by bots that are just going to write scripts and all these sorts of things. So I think it's a very acute across all different kind of platforms. Before that question, I was just going to add to what Spencer and Jennifer had said, which is, I think there's two other areas that I think are really interesting for me. One is the continued discussion, and you kind of said something, alluded to this at the beginning of the call, Matt, which is where a lot of people attended and reassured by podcasts being able to secure clients the kind of reach and a sort of understanding around measurement that they're looking for. I still think there's a whole swathe of improvements that can be made in that area, and I think we're all desperately waiting to see how we can truly crack the nut of absolute guaranteed understanding around attribution in podcast. I don't think anybody's fully cracked it yet, so I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in that space. Furthermore, because let's be very direct with a lot of the marketeers that we work with and all our agencies work with, the individuals who manage these campaigns and these budgets come from a digital world where they're used to having a plethora of rigor and detail and digital measurement that can absolutely support any decision they're taking. So as they enter into the world of podcast, which we can argue straddles both digital and analog to many degrees, they're not necessarily seeing the same amount of reassurance in the measurement. So I think that's definitely a space that needs to be continually plowed forward. And I know there's lots of players in the space who are doing that. So looking forward to the advent and the development there. And secondly, international. I mean, I think it's seeing an even larger growth from a lower base. I think it's like 29 to 30% growth year over year in the UK versus only 11% last year overall in terms of advertising growth. So again, I think international is going to be the next foray for all of us. The beauty of which is you can tend to buy, not giving away all our company secrets, but you can buy a lot of those shows from the US. So you don't have the same complications about having to put dollars at a local level and buy. You can really reach those audiences through US trading points. So looking forward to seeing the growth there as well.
Well, and on that point of international, speaking of special episodes, we have a special episode coming out in the next month focused on international. So for those who are interested in hearing more, please tune in. And that concludes my live read for Oxford Road's presentation of the Media Roundtable.
You did it very well.
You're being too generous, as always. But speaking of your generosity, thank you so much for coming on. I know it was a quick turnaround. You're still trying to dig out of your inbox, but we're forever grateful to hear the perspective of your perspective and some perspective of the IAB and the fabulous event that you guys are able to put on year after year, either remote or in person. And we hope moving forward, it's always in person and it continues to expand.
Yes, from your mouth to God's ears.
All right. As always, this show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you to not just know the news, but use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance your business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road. and subscribe to our newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you to our guest today, Matt Shapo, to the IAB, and to Bianca, Haley, Kyle, the team at Podcast One, and as always, influence responsibly.
Tired of getting sketchy texts? Imagine having a lie detector that scans your text, email, and social media for risky links, alerting you to scams before you click. McAfee Plus is just like that. Stop scammers in their tracks before they get to you and your personal data. Learn about living a more secure and private life online with McAfee Plus. And learn how to protect your everything at McAfee.com/podcast.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the classic Big Mac, Hamburglar.
Robble, robble.
He said, there's more sauce in every bite. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Robble. Available at most restaurants in this area.